The topic of the lecture which I picked was something I was writing on. It's really on advertising and how advertising has changed, obviously, in the last 10 years, especially with a view to social media. And I think, as you will see, I will talk about two main changes in advertising, largely powered by artificial intelligence. So in a way, this lecture brings together three different topics. One is advertising and regulating advertising. Secondly, how has social media and the internet more generally, but in particular social media, has changed advertising and how we need to reconsider regulation because of that change. And in particular, these changes, these technological changes, how they are driven by artificial intelligence and what that really means for regulation. So those are the sort of three areas we're looking at. So in the first section, I'll talk a little bit about what is advertising, which is perhaps obvious. And then secondly, how is advertising regulated? Well, going back probably to an era which in some ways perhaps is, for you guys, it might be a long time ago, but it is not really that long ago. So if you go back mentally to the 1990s, when you say most of the value in advertising was still, say, in broadcast advertising and in print media, obviously this time has gone. But the reason why I hark back to this time is not that things were better then, but just that our regulatory systems, I think, are still based largely on regulating advertising in print media and broadcast media. And what I want to do in this lecture really is to show you how advertising has changed and our regulation is still lagging behind massively. So the old assumption, going back to the 1990s and really broadcast advertising and print media advertising, the basic distinction between advertising and editorial content. So editorial content is the content for which the editor of a controlled media, such as broadcasting and a newspaper, is responsible. So in terms of the legality. And then on the other hand, advertising. And advertising had to be clearly separated from editorial content so that consumers can clearly identify advertising as advertising. And advertising, basically, perhaps obviously, is advertising which promotes goods and services and, in a way, entices consumers to buy these goods and services. So the whole purpose, obviously, of advertising is to increase sales of goods and services and, in a way, persuade the consumer to buy more of a particular product. A distinction usually is made between marketing, which is obviously advertising in the sense that you want to increase the sales of goods and services through persuasive kind of information, and sales promotion, where you offer certain deals, such as a 2-for-1, again, in order to increase sales and to increase the use of a particular product. Advertising, I think, was always something which in some ways was controversial. There's, for example, spoof advertising, which I show here on this slide, in the sense that advertising, I think, has always been designed to influence people in a way to persuade them to buy more. I mean, that's good and bad. The bad thing is, especially I suppose, in relation to harmful goods such as alcohol, gambling, and other products. I guess now in the news in the UK is junk food and advertising in relation to junk food. So advertising always, in a way, had these two sides. On the one hand, advertising was seen as beneficial because clearly in a capitalist economy, you want to encourage people to buy goods and services. And the idea, although in some ways obviously that's theory rather than reality, the idea is that advertising informs the consumer which goods and services to pick, and therefore plays an important role in a free market economy. Why do we regulate advertising? Well, the first thing, I guess, is perhaps an ethical point, that advertising is consumer information. It leads to rational consumer decisions, and clearly it doesn't have that function if the advertising itself is untruthful or misleading. because only then has it got that beneficial effect of promoting competition and in a way the best products, if it is actually informative and not misleading. So advertising, this is one of those general principles which you find, for example, also in the ICC Code of Advertising. Advertising must be honest, truthful, and not misleading. So there's always the question, so that advertising clearly is not just about influencing consumers in a rational way. Advertising obviously doesn't just appeal to our rational and sensible, in a way, decision-making processes, but it's to a certain extent also about manipulating consumer. And therefore, I guess consumer protection law has traditionally tried to balance and prohibit unfair consumer manipulation. But I think different legal systems and different cultures will have very different sets of regulation on this. And I'll come back to this later on in the lecture. And then a third reason to regulate advertising is clearly protection from fraud or things like pyramid schemes, which are not beneficial to the consumer at all and are basically just fraudulent. Then we regulate, for obvious reasons, advertising for risky, unhealthy, or addictive products. Examples is obviously tobacco advertising, which, for example, in the European Union, including the UK, is prohibited. Then other products are also strictly regulated, such as alcohol or gambling, junk food, which I already mentioned. Now, one interesting aspect of the regulation of advertising is to what extent does the law allow political advertising? So, for example, in the UK, there has been a long-standing prohibition on political advertising on television. Other countries have rules on, have kind of parity rules where each political party gets X number of minutes in order to, in a way, give each type of political movement or political party the same amount or the same opportunity in a democratic society if you want diversity of opinion. Similar questions relate in relation to environmental protection. So sometimes advertising regulation in a country can go much wider and encompass regulation on, for example, environmental protection, so that advertisers shouldn't be allowed to advertise goods which are particularly polluting. The whole debate about fake news, so I guess, goes in that direction in relation to political advertising, or advertising which is overtly sexist or racist. So sometimes advertising regulation encompasses more political goals, which go beyond the pure economic regulation of advertising. Another aspect, of course, is the protection of children, because a lot of goods and services clearly are not suitable for children, so they shouldn't be advertised to children. Again, this is, I guess, tobacco, alcohol, gambling, junk food. But of course, children and especially teenagers populate some of the same spaces. So it was always difficult. So in the broadcasting area and TV, we have the watershed that certain types of advertising must not appear after 9 o'clock. But in the online world, that is completely impossible, because obviously if you don't age verify users, then you wouldn't even know whether they're a child or not. The final aspect is the conflict and the balance between advertising as a form of art, sometimes, of course, and freedom of expression, versus regulating advertising for all these reasons which I've just mentioned. So these are basically the reasons why we regulate advertising. And these reasons, I guess, they are true in the old media world, and they're still true in the new media and social media world. Now, in the UK and in many countries in Europe, but actually it's a minority of countries in Europe, they regulate advertising primarily by so-called soft law, in other words, co-regulation. And what is co-regulation or self-regulation? It's basically codes of conduct and ethical standards which are drawn up by the advertising standards, by the advertising industry themselves. So basically in the UK, we have the Advertising Standards Authority and the Committee of Advertising Practice. Those two bodies draw up the code and then adjudicate on any infringements of the code. So this is not government regulation or legislation which has been made by Parliament, but actually a code of conduct which has been drawn up by a body which is composed of advertising industry as well as main consumer protection bodies and various other stakeholders. So we have two types of codes. One is the Committee of Advertising Practice Code, and the other one is the Broadcast Committee Advertising Committee Code. And basically this is like a comprehensive guidance document for everyone who produces advertising or for everyone who advertises. It contains all the legal and self-regulatory standards. And obviously I provide a link here. But the courts have held in the Matthias draft case that this is sort of has a legal status. So this is not just a purely voluntary industry code, but it has actually the status of law in the sense that, for example, if advertising is taken down, then the advertiser can go to court and have this decision from the Advertising Standards Authority judicially reviewed. So I won't really go into detail, but clearly, members of the public who see an ad which they think is immoral or not in compliance with the advertising code, they can then complain, and the Advertising Standards Authority will adjudicate whether this is a breach of the code. But what are the sanctions and penalties, you might ask? Well, the idea is that all the media owners, and that includes, I guess, your Google and Facebooks, take part in the system of self-regulation. So if the Advertising Standards Authority adjudicates an ad as being contrary to the code, they will then take it down. So that's basically the penalty. So there are no sanctions, there are no fines. It's not obviously criminal in any way, but the ad will be taken down. Now, in the offline advertising world, that might have worked quite well, because obviously for broadcast advertising, it's necessary to get clearance before the broadcast. So the Advertising Standards Authority has to look at the ad and has to say, okay, yeah, that's fine. If it's not in compliance with the code, then it won't be broadcast. And for newspaper and billboards and all other offline forms of advertising, then the ad will be taken down. But in the online world, this is more difficult because obviously it takes a lot of time before things are taken down, say on Facebook, and a lot of people will have already seen it. And more importantly, the ad, especially if it's sort of funny or edgy or critical, it will actually have been reposted, etc. So to remove something completely from the internet is probably completely impossible. Now, this form of self-regulation of advertising through the advertising codes, which I've just mentioned, is complemented by hard law regulation. And these are the two main, this is the main piece of legislation, which was originally a European directive, the Anti-Commercial Practices Directive from 2005, which has been implemented and is still good law despite Brexit, the Consumer Protection from Unfair Trading Regulations 2008. This protects essentially against fraudulent or misleading advertising, also aggressive selling and undue influence. This is enforced by Ofcom and the competition, or used to be Ofcom, sorry, it's now the Competition and Markets Authority, which is basically a form of consumer protection legislation. Sorry, I have to look out this one. Having run through the main forms of regulation, which is co- and self-regulation and the Unfair Commercial Practices Directive, I would argue that online advertising is completely different and that it also needs to be regulated in a different way. Okay, so before I make the case for this, I think it might be useful to understand a little bit more what is actually online advertising. And obviously when I say online advertising, it's not just one phenomenon. There are different forms of online advertising with very different implications. And essentially, I distinguish between 6 different forms of online advertising in the 21st century online ecosystem. They do overlap, so they're not mutually exclusive. But I think if you want to conceptualize what type of online advertising is there, then I think hopefully that helps you to better understand the landscape. Well, perhaps the first one chronologically is digital display marketing. So what I mean here is, you know, your pop-up windows, your banner advertising on a website, and basically this in a way was, especially in the early days of the internet, was the main form of advertising. So you look at the website owner might provide free content, and in order to finance that free content, they allow advertisers to place banner advertising on their website, and then if someone clicks on this, then basically the advertiser whose products are being advertised pays a fee, which ultimately the website owner will get a commission from. Now, these are basically placed to a series of networks and ad exchanges. The process now is totally automated, of course, and basically it takes seconds or milliseconds, I should say, in order to match an advertiser who wants to place their product and the website who's prepared to host an advertising banner. Now, this form of advertising is still, I would say, relatively common for some media publications, newspapers, etc. Although I think more profitable now is social media advertising from the advertiser's point of view. But obviously we still see banner advertising and pop-ups. The second form of advertising, which obviously made Google very, very, very powerful and very rich, is obviously search engine marketing. We're obviously all familiar with this. This is based essentially on keywords or organic search optimization. So in other words, if you're an advertiser and you want people to find your goods or services, you will register with Google certain keywords which are used to find your goods and services. And then if a user somewhere else types in those keywords into the search engine, a link to the advertiser's website will appear in the commercial search results. So we're now all used to that. When we search on Google, for example, there'll be a number of advertising search results on Google. The third one, of course, then is advertising on social media. Now, of course, any advertiser who wants their goods and services promoted can basically advertise on Facebook or Instagram or Twitter. This is essentially paid for advertising offered and placed by the social media company. So in other words, the social media company here acts as the ad exchange, and can take various forms: banners, pop-ups, posts, commercial tweets, video clips before the main video, if you think of video sharing sites. So these are basically placed using the social media's own ad exchange or ad network. Number 4, which is obviously fairly recent, and I guess is intimately connected to the use of social media, the increased use of social media, is the use of affiliates and influencers and brand ambassadors. So basically, these are people who, in a way, pretend, if you want, to be just a normal user, posting user-generated content on Twitter or Instagram. So at first sight, it just looks as though a normal user is just posting something on Twitter. But of course, these people are paid to post these recommendations or whatever they are. And this is, if you think about earlier, I said one of the fundamental principles is that advertising and editorial content is separated. Well, that obviously flies in the face of that principle. And I'll come back to that because this is one of the reasons I think how online advertising is very different. So obviously social networks have allowed individuals to become very powerful and build a network of many, many followers, friends, or whatever they're called, and then advertise products and services to them. So this is very similar to number 5, so advertising placed on social media as user-generated content. So obviously, I mean, I remember still when you first used Facebook, actually most of the content was literally just the posts, etc., from the wall of your friends. Whereas I think now with my own Facebook account, 2/3 of it is advertising placed on the social media, which just looks like user-generated content. And then 6 obviously overlaps with 4 and 5 as well, is affiliate advertising through websites such as gambling tipsters, comparison sites, and information sites. So in other words, basically we all use sort of price comparison or tipster sites. These are often not just individuals who mean well and just kind of use their expertise to give you recommendations. No, these are often people obviously who are systematically paid by their commercial agents. So these are the sort of 6 types of online advertising, I think, which have arisen in the last, I don't know, 20 years, the last 3 probably in the last 10 years. Okay, are you still with me actually? I'll just have a quick look at the chats, etc. You're still good? I'll have to come out of sharing. Okay. Any questions so far? But okay, here's asking someone, where does a B2B advertising activity fall? I guess the question probably is whether that also falls within the advertising regulatory system. So yes, so the codes don't just apply to consumer advertising. They also apply to business advertising, whereas you're right, actually the consumer protection regulations, the hard law, advertising law I talked about, that would only apply B2C. So yes, that's also another distinction one could make between advertising standards which apply B2B and B2C, and advertising standards which are more like consumer protection. Yeah, fair point. Any other questions? You still with me? Okay. I'll go back to my slides then. Okay, so these are the different types of advertising. Now, why is online advertising completely different? And when I say completely different, I think of online advertising, I guess from a lawyer's point of view, in the sense that I ask myself, is today's regulatory system still addressing the potential harms which advertising could pose? So when I say different, I guess different, it always depends on your viewpoint, doesn't it? So the viewpoint here is very much from a lawyer point of view. So I think there are 2 main differences in terms of how advertising should be regulated. One of them I guess I already alluded to. But the main difference is the first one, which I mentioned here, and that's basically that, of course, the fundamental revolution, which I think has made advertising much more efficient, much more cost-effective, much more relevant to the individual user, is the fact, as probably you all are aware, that advertising online is usually targeted based on some sort of online profile which the advertiser uses in order to target the advertising to a particular user. So if you think of broadcast advertising in the old days, in the purely offline days, clearly everyone, when you watched your favorite TV program in the old days, everyone would get exactly the same ad. And for some of us, you know, this was the reason to quickly get up and make a cup of tea. For others of us, I guess we might have enjoyed the advertising, and for a number of us, it would have perhaps stimulated us to actually buy the goods and services. The main difference now is that we might consume exactly the same social media, but the advertising we see will be very, very different because the advertising is targeted on our individual profile. I think that is probably the main difference to advertising as it was before, the targeted nature, which makes it much more effective, much more efficient, but there are some ethical concerns which I come back to. So that's the first difference. The second difference I've already mentioned, because I think one of the fundamental principles of advertising regulation has really been that advertising should be recognizable as such. The consumer, the user should be able to identify what is advertising and what is actually not advertising. And clearly this new type of advertising by influencers is opaque. So, you know, you might look at this ad and you look at it and you just think, well, this is just a user posting a comment or a user posting a recommendation of goods. I don't know if you recently have bought any consumer goods, but I bought recently a Hoover, and in order to decide what Hoover to buy, you go to YouTube, of course, right? And you look at different models, and there are loads and loads of videos. I know this is really sad, isn't it? So it's not really as I watched on YouTube. But anyway, so you might watch that you might watch a video of, you know, one of these consumers who tests, and then I sort of sit down and I think, well, does she really recommend this Hoover because she's been paid? Or does she recommend, or is this a genuine user-generated post? Because, you know, I guess just as generosity, or people like filming themselves, or they like acting, or, you know, there's the normal sort of YouTube fame. So that is exactly the problem here. I think that it's opaque use of commercial advertising in user-generated content on social media platforms. It's not clear whether it's advertising at all, in other words. So I have finished a report for the European Commission on the regulation of gambling, and one of the sections of this research was looking specifically at the regulation of advertising for gambling in this case. And we did so this was a project which ran 2018, 2019, and we had a research team of 5 of us, 2 computer scientists, and the computer scientist, one of them, Ranjan Padmadasa, he did a influencer study on Twitter where he looked under hashtags related to football betting. I think it was in the summer, probably May and June 2018, and he looked at the sort of posts and picked out those posts where simply it wasn't clear whether this is just a young man bragging about a particular bet, or is this person actually an influencer who gets paid, in this case, by Ladbrokes. If you look at this, it's a bit smaller print, but we can see it on your machine. There is a very small hashtag ad. In fact, it's so small. I'm not that close to my screen. I can't see it, but yeah, actually it's right at the top. So this is the reality TV star. I don't know if any of you know him, but no, it's not that. There is a very small hashtag ad. So, oh yeah, no, it's terms and conditions apply ad. Yeah, so that, I guess, so it's above the photograph. It's in very small print. Now, my interesting question, actually, who of you would think, seeing just this Twitter post, who of you would actually think that this is an ad? I thought I could do a quiz, but actually I can't show, I don't think I can do this at the same time, show you the slide and do the quiz at the same time. So if you post in the chat, who thinks, hold on, I get it up again. What's this? So how do I go back here? Okay, so looking at this Twitter post, big weekend for sports, but look forward to this one most. Check out this unbelievable Ladbrokes. I'll put obviously a link. A goal to be scored, 90 minutes, Champions League final, 40-1, kickoff, 7:45 on Saturday, and then the link. Who of you would think, this is an ad, this guy gets paid to post this? And who of you thinks, well, this could just be a user-generated, your normal user-generated post, which we all post hundreds every day. So I think what I've wanted to show is this example that actually it's not always clear on social media, but if something is posted by effectively someone who's an advertising agent and gets a commission on anyone who clicks through that link, or whether it's an ad. So I would say this opaque use of user-generated advertising contradicts three of the fundamental principles of advertising. For example, marketing communications must be obviously identifiable as such, because obviously it is not. Secondly, advertisers should not false claim or imply that they are acting as consumers. And thirdly, advertising must not be misleading. I guess one of the main issues here is if advertising cannot be recognized as such, it cannot be regulated, obviously, because we don't regulate user-generated comments in the same way as we regulate advertising. So, for example, a country might ban advertising of tobacco, but it would allow users to discuss tobacco products. So traditionally in advertising regulation, we've made this distinction between, freedom of speech, people can talk about stuff, but if it is commercial and if it's advertising, then it's regulated. Well, if you can't distinguish between advertising and non-advertising, you can't regulate it. It's almost as simple as that. Now, the Advertising Standards Authority in the UK obviously has recognized this problem and has issued a guidance document. And basically this recommends that people who are influencers and who are commercially paid for advertising, that they should label their ad with a hashtag ad. But I would say this is fairly ineffective because it's not obvious, isn't it? If there's this tiny little hashtag ad in the corner, would everyone seeing this post really realize that this is influencer advertising? And I argue that really it should be the responsibility of social media companies to regulate influencer advertising. Of course, they have no interest in doing so because ultimately they make money out of that too. Okay, so that was the first point, which is really the point that there's a lot of opaque use of advertising in user-generated comments. That's the first major difference, I think. The second major difference is perhaps more importantly, and it's more important also in the context of this particular topic, because it's associated with the use of artificial intelligence. Now, I did a speech at a conference for people in video conferencing, and basically they wanted a speech on advertising regulation of video on demand, so YouTube's and video sharing platforms, and how really, I guess, filmmaking and content making is changing. And here really the drive for, and one of the things I was sort of thinking in that context was, what are the drivers for profit in this area? Because clearly the YouTube videos, other than obviously the copyrighted stuff, is really the dominant business model is free, right? And it has been now for a number of years. And so the question, obviously, from someone who produces content, the important question is, how do you make money out of it? Obviously. So how can you make advertising profitable in a free, dominantly free content business model? That's the question from the economic point of view, of course. So The answer to that, I guess, is persuasive designs. So the whole goal is to attract eyeballs, and not only attract eyeballs and get people to watch, but also retain their interest. So the incentive is to create as immersive an environment as possible. We're all aware of that, of course. And you know, features such as, if you think of YouTube and other content sharing platforms, constant play. You know, this is so annoying, isn't it? You want to watch one YouTube video and then the other one starts playing. And sometimes I get really angry if you can't sort of switch it off. I'm sure we've all been there. And that's all the reason for that is obviously that you need to retain the people on the platform. You have to keep them listening in order to make money out of them. This has been seen very negative also by, I guess, various government agencies, because does it lead to addiction, for example, in young people who are so glued to the screen that it almost becomes an addiction issue. So in the UK government's online housewife paper of April last year, they were strongly criticising persuasive designs based on the UK Chief Medical Office report on the impact of this immersive design on young people's mental health. I mean, probably contentious, but there's one concern here. The other aspect of this is, other than the immersive environment, is something I want to talk a little bit more about, and that's the profiling aspect. Okay, we're all obviously familiar, I think, in this day and age with online profiling. This has been there, of course, from the start of the internet. It's one of the most important and most profitable technologies, I guess, of the internet. So we're all being traced through technologies such as cookies, flash cookies, digital fingerprinting, which basically track our browsing patterns, you know, what websites we look at, what web pages, how long we look at them, our consumption patterns in terms of what content we consume, what we buy, our social media interests, our posts, our location data, etc. And this data is then aggregated and is used to create various user profiles of us. And of course, data mining technologies are used to infer characteristics of us, but also to predict our future behavior. And of course, technology like this, quite obviously, is hugely useful, profitable for advertising. You know, if you can predict what someone wants, if you can predict what they're going to buy next, then obviously that's great for advertising. So the main difference is to offline advertising is obviously that online advertising is largely targeted and influences people so that advertising becomes more effective, more cost efficient, which of course is economically good. But on the bad side, it's also becoming more manipulative. Artificial intelligence, maybe I should say a little bit more about that. Obviously, artificial intelligence is a very wide field. The legal and ethical issues obviously range and largely depend really on the application in which artificial intelligence is used. And I'm only looking here really at advertising, which is only one small application. But just to give you a bit of a wider picture for a second, artificial intelligence ranges from face recognition tools to autonomous vehicles, which there's a lot of writing about at the moment. Search engines, of course, are a form of artificial intelligence. Translation tools, I don't know, programs predicting price developments in stock markets. There are probably endless applications of artificial intelligence. It's obviously also important to point out that artificial intelligence has major advantages for humankind. You know, if you think of the medical advances, I think, which will be made in the next few years, enhancing the tools to fight crime and terrorism, it helps us hopefully to achieve environmental goals by better use of resources, etc., etc., etc. The problem is the mismanagement of technology, as always, and there have been also hugely critical voices raising enormous concerns, I guess. The most prominent of this was Stephen Hawking, who said it's the worst event in human history and will ultimately, I think, lead to the destruction of humanity. So, but I think what amongst lawyers is recognized is that there's a huge conflict between the normative foundations of our civilization, such as the idea that we are autonomous, that we should have privacy, and the actual use of AI in practice. Sorry, this is actually in the wrong order. So what is artificial intelligence? Clearly, artificial intelligence is a bundle of different technologies. But what it brings, I guess the name gives it away, what brings these technologies together is that computers imitate different features which were in the past uniquely associated with human intelligence. So think of things like recognizing the meaning of text, the meaning of words, semantic text recognition, such as you have, for example, with Siri or Alexa, voice recognition, which again is used, for example, in online banking or telephone banking, face recognition, which has huge implications for surveillance, but also for security, who you give access to a building, calculating the best route to a target. Well, we all use these sorts of tools, interpreting the meaning of an image, decision making, more and more automated decision making, making plans for the future, etc. All these kind of activities of the human brain, which are partly at least imitated by technology. Now, in relation to advertising again, I guess profiling, the idea that a profile of us is built is based on pattern recognition or a statistical correlation. So, for example, obviously, Amazon for a long time was a leader in this field right from the start of e-commerce. Someone who likes this book likes this film, so we advertise this film to them. The sort of recommendation system of Amazon, which for me never worked. I don't know what your experience with that is, but I buy a whole range of books and stuff on Amazon, and the things they recommend to me, I was thinking, no. So in some ways, my own personal experience is that it's not actually that good. But actually, I was just talking to someone yesterday who said they think this is really good. So I guess it depends as well. Okay, so you can say, well, that's useful because it actually helps the consumer to orientate himself or herself, by rather than having to, browse for hours in a bookshop. You now get the things you most likely, to like, recommended to you. But it's not just based on, that's relatively innocent, I would say, but it could also be based on, because it's based on statistical correlation, there's no rationale behind here. There could be other statistical correlations which actually relate more irrational or subliminal links. So, for example, this is an example I made up. This is obviously not real, but there will be things like this. So someone who is exposed to a particular color is then more likely to buy a particular beer. So there could be statistical correlation that certain patterns of your behavior is based on stimuli such as color, which you yourself not even aware, right? Who says that our motivations to buy goods and services is always irrational? Often it's irrational. It's triggered by something subliminal. And of course, if you use profiling, then you can actually find out what are these links, and is that beneficial? Beneficial to the advertiser, of course, but beneficial to society as a whole. So there is a big question, and I think this question has to be underlined 15 times. It's a big question to what extent the use of artificial intelligence and profiling and machine learning and deep learning actually leads to a system which we could better describe as a form of undue influence, which really conflicts with individual autonomy. I think in many ways, legal systems are based on this idea that individuals should be autonomous, that we are rational beings, that we're capable of making rational decisions, which are good for us and good for society. But in a way, these types of technologies I'm describing here could well be used to manipulate us and in a way undermine that rational or individual decision making. And this is something which is, I'm sure you've seen this as well in the context of artificial intelligence, and in particular face recognition and the use of face recognition to track people, you know, as they move about, and the use of either face masks or makeup in a way to defeat these kind of face recognition systems. And here's just one example. There are others, whether they work or not, I don't know. I guess at the moment, everyone is wearing face masks, so perhaps it's not such an issue right at the moment, at least. Okay, so what about the law now on this? So I've talked about the use of online profiling and artificial intelligence, and this is used to target particular products at individual consumers. What does the law say to this? Now, in Europe, in the EU more specifically, this area is largely subsumed or dealt with, in addition to the specific regulation of advertising, by the law on data protection, which, as you may or may not be aware, now is the General Data Protection Regulation EU 2016-679. So if you hopefully come and study with us and you take the courses on in the TMT law area, then you will come across the General Data Protection Regulation, probably in many different facets. I obviously don't have the time now to go. It's a very complex and long and very important instrument, because obviously it governs the whole area of data protection. But just to mention here now that this contains a whole host of fair and lawful processing principles. In other words, in order to carry out online profiling, the advertiser needs either the informed consent or some other legitimate objective. There are important principles which relate to privacy by design, the idea that new technology should be designed in such a way that it doesn't unduly infringe on individuals' privacy. And that's one of the guiding principles which has been implemented by this regulation, as well as that option, you know, should be privacy by default. So, okay, consumers can opt out if they don't, if they say, okay, I want cheaper goods or I want more targeted advertising. So, and I guess what is being discussed in this area is that, or in the area of artificial intelligence, I should say, is the idea that the use of artificial intelligence tools should be made more transparent, and the users should have a right that actually the technology is explained to them. So rather than having this black box and people don't understanding why they are being advertised, this should be made more transparent. I'm not really sure this works, because how does the consent usually work? Well, the consent usually works that, you know, you are asked, do you agree to the privacy policy, or do you agree to the terms and conditions? And this is probably a pop-up window and you just want to get rid of it, so you quickly press yes, and you just want to consume your free content because you don't have the time to spend half an hour reading the privacy policy. That is the reality. I guess consumers want both. They want privacy, but they also want free content. So how does that really help? If you say, well, if you consent to it, your privacy can be invaded. The actual harms which stem from online profiling, I think, are too complex and too latent for consumers to not consent, if you know what I mean. There is a wider picture, and the wider picture is this whole issue of, you know, this process is obviously not just used for big data, for profiling and advertising, but obviously big data and profiling are used in many other sectors, which have implications which go far beyond just consumer protection and advertising regulation. A good example for that is the Cambridge Analytica scandal, which you may or may not have heard. So this, we're talking here about 2017 or so, where basically Facebook's data has been used for political advertising and voter manipulation. How did this work? So there was a scientist basically at Cambridge University, whose name I can't remember now. He was a psychologist, and he was an expert on psychological profiling, psychometric profiling, I guess is the correct word. So in other words, there are theories, there are, I don't know, about 5 or 6 character types, and depending on which character type you fall into, advertising needs to be changed in its message. So I can't remember, it was something like someone who's very timid and fearful, someone who's very extrovert and aggressive, someone who's sort of more a family, social sort of type. I don't know, there were 5 or 6 along those lines. And they would use users' Facebook data to categorize people into one of those 5 types. And one of the examples given was, for example, was in the US elections of 2016, I think it was, they used ads to kind of the gun lobby in the US, who basically lobbies for the free use of guns and free ownership of guns. They use 5 different types of ads depending on the profile. So if someone was categorized as a more fearful sort of personality type, they would be shown a picture of a burglar, and basically the message was, look, you need to have the right to have a gun because you might want to fight a burglar off. So that was the ad for the fearful person. Then there was an ad for someone who was the family social type. Well, they would then show them basically a picture of father and son out and about in the countryside hunting with a gun. So it was a completely different message, but the message is the same. Look, we need to allow people to have guns. And then the aggressive sort of type was shown a picture of someone, who does shooting as a sport, play pigeon shooting or something like that. So in other words, the political message was tailored to the kind of personality traits which the profile had indicated. And that, if you think about political advertising, is obviously, political advertising always has been, I guess, been alluding to emotional kind of aspects. So it's not entirely rational, but there is the question, isn't there, whether this type of advertising on social media is actually undermining democracy and free choice in this particular matter. One of the main concerns is also price discrimination. So in other words, these user profiles are not just used for advertising, but they're also used to charge different prices to different consumers. And discrimination, unfair discrimination is another issue. Talking about the Cambridge Analytica scandal, the Information Commissioner's Office fined Facebook in October 2018 after the Cambridge Analytica scandal has sort of been in the press. The maximum fine, which was back then £500,000. So the verdict was that the investigation had found that between 2007 and 2014, Facebook had unlawfully processed the personal information of users unfairly by allowing application developers, such as Cambridge Analytica, access to their information without clear and informed consent. So data protection law has some grip on this, but I would argue that this is perhaps not entirely clear and not entirely effective. And in a way, it is a threat to individual autonomy. I think I'm running out of time, so I'm just quickly summing up. So one more example I want to mention here, so on this topic of the manipulative nature of advertising through online profiling and targeting powered by artificial intelligence. This is now, again, relates to my research in the area of advertising online gambling. There was some evidence that in 2017, the online gambling companies have used people's profiles and then targeted gambling advertising, online casinos, for example, specifically at people who were unemployed, specifically at people who had already gambling problems. So in a way, they did exactly the opposite of what the regulation says. So that's another example where I think the specific targeting is actually very nefarious. So my argument is, and I've written an article on this, maybe I should make this available, that data protection is not sufficient, I think, to deal with this manipulative side of advertising based on online profiling, because the data protection regulation focuses too much on consent, and maybe consumers or users don't actually know what they're consenting to. So in some ways, this means that we should revive unfair trading kind of laws, in particular consumer protection law. So this is really not about data protection. I think it's more about unfair manipulation. And in a way, we need to work out what are the standards in this particular respect. There is a piece of legislation which I mentioned earlier, which is in the UK, the Consumer Protection for Unfair Trading Regulation, which specifically prohibits aggressive practices. It prohibits undue influences which affect consumer choice. The problem here is, how do you enforce this? So, you know, this is okay. We have this piece of regulation. In theory, the regulator, the Competition and Markets Authority, could fine a business, but because they're often abroad, there's also a jurisdictional issue. So, conclusion. Hopefully, after this lecture, you agree with me that online advertising is very, very different from offline advertising, in particular because of influencer advertising on social media and because of the targeted nature of online advertising. So, based on profiles, based on data mining and the use of artificial intelligence. This can be addressed partly by data protection laws, but because consent would justify data processing, I think we need, in a way, a new approach to artificial intelligence and consumer protection. Thank you very much for listening. So I'll end the slide show here. And I'm now available if you have comments, questions. Please feel free to come in. All you have to do is unmute your microphone, and yeah, or I'll have a look at the chat. There's another question here. So someone asks, to what extent do you think regulation of artificial intelligence will enforce this? While every country have individual laws in terms of artificial intelligence. So I think that there are quite a few questions or comments maybe in your question. The first one is, does it really make sense? And this is something where I personally am not convinced yet. Does it really make sense to regulate artificial intelligence in this very, very sort of global manner? Because artificial intelligence is used for so many different things. So if you think this whole debate there is on autonomous cars, and this question of, you know, who should be liable if there is a mistake, say, in software and do cars crash, or the ethical dilemmas, you know, if the car driver has, you know, if there's a choice between killing a pedestrian or killing the driver, which choice should the artificial intelligence make? There are all sorts of questions specific on that. And then the questions, I guess, I was discussing today, which were more about online advertising, are very, very different, because it's not about, you know, these kind of conflicts of liability or the conflicts, the ethical conflicts. This is more about, I guess, autonomy and what is undue influence in this new, brave new world of artificial intelligence. Other areas will also, of course, raise questions of autonomy and to what extent we need to regulate that. But I personally, and I'm sure a lot of people will disagree, this is not necessarily very clear, but I'm not very sure whether it makes sense to regulate artificial intelligence overall, because there's so many different applications. They all raise their own unique problems. It's a bit like, say, how do we regulate the internet? Well, it depends. But people will disagree with that. So I'm not saying this is the... and the other issue you raised, I think, really is the question of enforcement, because it's all very well to have a law if it can't be enforced. And of course, as you rightly point out, different countries will regulate artificial intelligence in very different manners for various reasons, partly for economic reasons, partly because of cultural differences. But that's, I guess, what is the same problem as the internet generally. But I think definitely that we need to work out in a way, perhaps initially more from an ethical point of view, what are the ethical issues and how can they be implemented in the technology. And there I think this concept, which I've mentioned in the context of data protection, of privacy by design, you could say, well, in a way we need ethical design. So in a way, if we widen that out to the development, and that's to my extent, in my opinion, it's largely a question of a dialogue, training between people who develop the technology, who might not think about the ethical issues. You know, they might have other incentives when they develop this technology.